I speak to you in the name of the one God. May my words be somehow pleasing to you, great mystery, and helpful for us as we journey. Amen. Please be seated. Ooh, something's humming. Hi, everyone. It's really great to be with you. Some of you I know. Okay, I will try. I was just adjusting it here. I've been in the Synod office since 2018, but this is actually my first time here on a Sunday morning, so it's really wonderful. It's truly an honor to serve the diocese and the bishop as executive director, and I'm humbled and energized by the thought of what these next years will look like in our life as a diocese. As the bishop has been saying on repeat over the last little while, the future is not going to look like the past, and the future is bright. Change is happening, and with change comes grief and lament, but after that, a renewed hope and new possibilities. So it's great. In today's reading from Isaiah, we have this wonderful and iconic passages. One of these passages that reframes our perspective in the light of God's and reminds us of our finitude, but at the same time calls us forward to participate in the vastness of what God is doing. These passages pop up throughout the Bible, and I'm glad they do, because we need this reminder regularly. And I'll read a little bit of again. Have you not known, have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not faint or grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable. He gives power to the faint and strengthens the powerless. Even youths will faint and be weary, and the young will fall exhausted. But those who wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. And that gospel hymn has just been bumping around in my head over the last little while. So I don't know about you, but when I read that passage, I find myself most closely identifying with the ones in the passage who are feeling weary and exhausted and powerless and faint. Anyone else? I think there's many reasons for this. Our fast-paced, technology-dominated ethos is one. The scarcity mindset that we are formed in as we are bombarded by advertising constantly. And for us in the church, the responsibilities of our inheritance, both the good and the hard, as we're facing diminishing resources. And this, my friends, is not a new phenomenon. I'll remind you that we've been struggling with this for a long time. In his charge to synod in March 2004, which is 20 years ago, surprisingly, Bishop James Cowan said this: "Our leadership, clergy, and laity alike is tired, very tired. Our human resources seem stretched to the limit. Our material resources are focused on survival, and our emotional resources are transfixed by the fear of what tomorrow might bring. How can ministry be adapted to best meet the needs in this day and age?" Now, some of you, raise of hands, may have been there when those words were spoken originally. Some of you. I find Bishop Cowan's words here really interesting for a couple of reasons. The first is that on a broad sense, across the diocese, this fatigue or this felt sense of diminishment that our resources are maxed is not a new one. We've been here for a while. And this has been the context for many years. And the second thing is the question that he asks: how can our ministry be best adapted to meet the needs of the people here and now? And I think that question is as relevant as ever. And I would argue that we need to be asking that question at the structural level across the diocese, as well as the ministry level in parishes like this. We are a church in a time and a place that it makes not a whole lot of sense to be that in some ways. I don't know if many of you are familiar with the latest census data, but our diocese has 2 of the top 3 most non-religious cities in Canada and therefore North America. 60% of the adults in Victoria identify as having no religious affiliation whatsoever. So we, the faithful remnant, I could call us, as we are here gathered on a Sunday morning, are firmly in the minority. Even if you were to combine all faiths of all religions in our city, we'd still be in the minority. Our parishes up and down these islands and inlets are facing diminishing numbers of active parishioners, aging demographics, tighter and tighter budgets, and buildings that are nearing the end of their useful lifespan. The model that we've inherited of parish life is becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. And this isn't necessarily new. And I would also probably suggest that the prospects of a sudden increase in interest in Anglican worship is modest. Not non-existent, but probably a little bit modest. We know that we are a fraction of the numbers that we were before, especially maybe back as far as the 1960s, when religious scholars and theologians really started noticing the shift of social context in the place and priority of religion. But we are still caring for as many buildings, as much land as we were when we were that number back then. So part of what I'm going to share with you a little bit this morning is some of the hope that I have and we have for navigating this present reality, and hopefully be able to seize the opportunities that are upon us to faithfully join in the movement of God. Because while all this is the case, God is not done with us yet, and that we can know for sure. So, despite these numbers, we know that our parishes are full of good and faithful people doing really good work. There are people caring for each other and for their communities in very tangible ways. The work that we're called to is big, but it is life-giving. And as you know, the diocese has been in this conversation about how are we going to navigate this uncertain future for quite some time. Throughout the 2000s, there was a series of, we now kind of jokingly refer to them as the alphabet committees, the DMRT, the DMRIT, and the DTT, these 3 subsequent committees kind of asking the questions about how are we going to adapt our structure and our model for the future. These ultimately led to the recommendation of the closure and disestablishment of a number of parishes and provided a bit of the context that Bishop Cowan was living in when he said those words that I shared earlier. And so while these reports didn't have direct implications for this community here at St. George, the ripple effects across the diocese were significant. And many people experienced the results of those as hurtful. And we still often hear those voices, people remembering what that was like and the hurt that it caused. And so now, we're not interested in repeating the same strategies of the past, but learning from what has happened in our own story. So the bishop isn't interested in closing down parishes or merging communities, but we are still very much interested in discerning together what God is doing in our communities and adjusting ourselves to faithfully join in that work. We recognize the model that we've relied on also to generate funds in the past is going to need to have some tweaks in order to enable us to faithfully live into this future that we can't fully see. We have a number of land holdings, and how we acquired those land holdings is really a history of colonialism, of our role in that process. And a side note here, we've over the last couple of years contracted a historian to start asking the question of how did we actually acquire these particular pieces of land? And those reports are kind of trickling in, and they're really fascinating. So look for those sometime in the future to learn more about that. Often we rent out some of our excess buildings, some space that we have, and mostly for below market rates that are really good for community organizations, such as the school over here. But overall, this is done on a fairly ad hoc basis and is sometimes very reactive. And for the most part, it's been fine. But we also know that on the other side, there's a temptation to think of our land only in terms of business terms, by seeking the highest and best use to maximize the financial gain of what we have. And that's also something that we're not entirely interested in. What we are hoping, though, is we can include our land in the question of how we pursue faithfulness of our ministry. So the lands themselves have a story of their own, and we must attend to those stories as we discern what faithfulness is going to look like. Jason McKinney, who is a friend and a priest from the Diocese of Toronto, has been thinking and talking about a theology of land for a couple years now. We brought him out last year when we had the colloquium up at UVic on church land. And one of the things that he talks about is these two different paradigms that we could use to think about how we deal with land. The one he calls the property paradigm, and the other he calls the commons paradigm. Property is exclusive, commons is shared. The verb of property is to have, while the verb of the commons is to hold. McKinney argues that although the property paradigm is the default in our context, the commons is more aligned with our faith convictions. So within having the posture over here of having, McKinney explains that to have is to grasp, to possess a thing, like land, which is perceived to be inert, mappable, and exchangeable. While over here, the posture of holding evokes to keep and to tend and to care for within a network of reciprocal obligations and relationships. So the power of the capitalist settler colonial ways of thinking and being that our society has just been formed in over many years have trained us to have over here. But I think if we reflect on it, the best version of ourselves aligned with our baptismal covenant longs for us to hold things in deep relationship with the people and the ecosystems of these islands and inlets. So McKinney is arguing that we as a church must remember that the land we steward is not just ours to have and exploit for institutional gain, but to hold for the good of the world. And in that way, we participate in the movement of God in our midst. Take for a moment to join me in a thought exercise. Recall those many years ago with the young lad on the hillside who was tasked to carry lunch, 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, that day beside the Sea of Galilee. This is from John 6. So I think we all know this story quite well, and without too much effort, we can think about how we can see the commons paradigm at work. The boy, seeing the crowd and being identified as being able to play a part in influencing the rest of the group through relationship, he saw a need. People were hungry, and he was probably a bit awestruck by the attention that he was getting from his little lunch that he had, but he was willing to share what he had. So with open hands, he was holding these gifts, and they were allowed to be transformed into much more than he could ask or imagine. What if, however, the boy was operating more out of that property paradigm? We can imagine that through seeing the loaves and fish as clearly within his jurisdiction and rights to decide what to do with them, he had dominion over those lunch. And he would have likely seen the risk then of losing what was rightfully his and his family's, and not wanting to probably risk the wrath of his mother for giving away their lunch. He may have just decided, that it was actually his to have and to be used for the purposes of his own control. So had this paradigm been at play when he was approached for using his property, there may have been 5,000 or so hungry folks on the hillside that day instead of 12 baskets of leftovers. So this brief exercise, I think, is illustrative of how we must be intentional to work from a paradigm that is aligned with our faith. We know that when we are at our best, we see what's happening, we hear what's going on in our communities, and we respond with the gifts that we hold. We know that much of our inheritance is the legacy of colonialism, and we rightly now look back at that and call those the sins of our fathers. The opportunity before us, knowing we have many land holdings and not a whole lot of liquid assets, is to rethink how we might offer what we have through redeveloping some of our lands for community benefit, which might also allow us to reimagine and live into a faithful future of being the church in these islands. We may also then hope for an excess of goodness being produced from what we have, and hope to sustain and generate revenue in a way that we haven't previously. So as we're exploring some of our diocesan sites for this purpose, I know that the group here has been looking at some of these similar things and asking some of these questions about this property. And as a community, I know you have a long history of thinking creatively about space. The orchard, this sideways orientation that we've got here, and the narthex are all examples of ways that you have taken what's been entrusted to you and with a bit of hard work, dedication, and creativity, transformed these sites into new and transformative possibilities. So starting this process of discernment is always a bit risky. We don't totally know where the journey will take us when we head off, but we know that what we'll find on this journey with each other is hopefully a continued way to be a faithful presence here in Cadboro Bay for years to come. We also know that nothing of this sort happens quickly, and so we must wait and trust in the Lord. There's also quite a drumbeat right now happening at all levels of government, housing. And we must make sure, though, that we use this drumbeat, I think, to our benefit, but making sure that we are attuned with our ears to the melodies and the harmonies of what the Spirit is doing. We have begun this process at other places throughout the diocese, and at the meeting I can share a little bit about what that's looking like elsewhere. And we also know that the Synod Office, we are a small but mighty team who has to always be aware of our capacity of taking on too much, but it's good. So I want to encourage you in your journey. You're asking some of the right questions, I think, to prepare us and to prepare you for the journey ahead. And I encourage you always to remember this passage from Isaiah, that if we wait and look for God throughout it all, we can renew our strength and ensure our place in the great story of God's work here in these islands and inlets. Amen.